Hi, this is Mr. Chandler. So now we're going to look at Standard 2. Standard 2 is about the expansion of the United States. In the first unit, we looked at the actual creation of the United States government and some of our underlying political philosophies. And we started talking about how some of those underlying political philosophies led to debate and led to the first two parties, the two-party system in the United States. So now we're going to talk about the expansion of the United States and how that's going to create more conflict and actually eventually lead to the Civil War. So one of the enduring understandings that you need to know out of Standard 2 is that political conflict is often the result of competing social values and economic interests. And you should be able to understand how different perspectives on those different interests and backgrounds is going to lead to political conflict in the pre-Civil War United States. That's what antebellum means, pre-Civil War United States. So we're going to start in Standard 2.1. In 2.1, we're looking very specifically, and that you should be able to do this at the end, you should be able to summarize the impact of the westward movement on nationalism and democracy. If you don't know what those two words mean, then make sure you look those up, including the expansion of the franchise, the displacement of Native Americans from the Southeast, and then also conflicts over states' rights and federal power during Andrew Jackson's term as president, and how that conflict over states' rights and federal power with the major land acquisitions that we get, like Louisiana, Oregon, and the Mexican Cession, is actually going to lead to the Civil War. We'll talk about how that is specifically. So the main way we expand during this time period, you see this on the map right here. The part in the orange is the part, you see it up here, the part in the orange is the part of the United States that's here at that point that are already states. The blue are territories of the United States. So the United States basically goes up to the Mississippi River. In 1803, we buy the Louisiana Purchase from France, and then a little bit later we're going to get that part over here in Texas and Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, California from Spain through two different wars. And then the part at the top, the Oregon country, is disputed land between us and Great Britain. So this is how we're going to go from having this little territory east of the Mississippi to having the entire United States that we know of today. So the growth of nationalism. Nationalism, is pride in one's country. Nationalism grows as the U.S. expands. Expansion becomes a priority during these early presidents. They want the United States to grow and grow and grow, and they think the more land we have, the stronger we'll be as a country, and the stronger our economy will be. And this is centered around the idea of manifest destiny, which we'll go over more in the next unit, but still you need to know. Manifest destiny is the belief that God gave us all of that land from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and that we're the best people to rule over it. The Americans were the best people to rule over it. So there's a little bit of racism and social Darwinism in there as well. So the first way we expanded was through the Louisiana Purchase. Thomas Jefferson, as president, is the one who purchased that, and he actually was debating with himself on whether he actually had the constitutional ability to buy that land. Because remember, he is a strict interpretationist. Remember from our unit on the Federalists and Democrat Republicans, he believed that if the Constitution didn't say it, then he couldn't do it. And the Constitution doesn't say anything about giving the national government the authority to buy land. But he does it anyways, even though it goes against his strict interpretation. And so the country doubles in size with that purchase. And so that's the importance. We grow tremendously as a country. We get all kinds of new resources. And that kind of goes along with the land ordinance of 1785, because then they're going to use that and how they're going to survey the land and then break up the land into new states. And then that's eventually going to lead to issues over whether those new states are going to be slave states or free states. And that's what's going to really lead to debate as we move forward. The spread of democracy. This new territory led to expansion democracy. The way states became states was they had to have a certain number of number of voters in order to become a state. And so almost all of the states did away with the landowner requirements to vote. And so this is going to be a major increase in democracy, a major increase in who could vote. And so this is a really big deal. And that actually came about through the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 too, because they were trying to create new states. So a lot of those new states didn't have that landowner requirement. This is a big deal at the time just in the world in general. Nowhere in the world can people vote like they can in the United States at that time. Politicians start campaigning during the elections, and they start trying to appeal to what was called the common man. The Democratic Party grew in power tremendously. That was tied to the presidency of Andrew Jackson, who was always thought of as like the common man. And so you take away the Republican out of Republican Democratic, and it just becomes the Democratic Party. And this is the same Democratic Party that we have today. And it was always thought to be a movement of the common man and trying to help this common man. As we start expanding further, we saw we got Louisiana, and we want to get more. We want to get more land. And so the first place we look is Oregon. Well, Oregon was disputed. We claimed it, and the British claimed it. We actually said this, we actually for a while both occupy it. That's what joint occupation means. We both occupy Oregon. And eventually what we're going to say is that we're going to start using this phrase, 54-40 or fight. 54-40 or fight basically refers to the parallel, which is way up here. Actually, you can't even see it on the screen. It's above the United States. So we're going to say we should have all the way up to that 54-40 line, or else we're going to fight for it. What eventually happens, though, is that we get a treaty with the British, and we end up dividing the Oregon Territory between the United States and Britain. And what we agree to is basically at the 49th parallel right here. We agree to split Oregon into two parts, and so we get this part, and the British get the part above it. We're going into more detail about the Texas Revolution later, but this is another way that we get some land. Texas declares its independence from Mexico, partly because they wanted to have slaves, and the Mexican government didn't really like them having slaves, and they didn't really get along with religion, since Mexico was Catholic and the American settlers in Texas were Protestant. And so the American settlers declared their revolution, they declared their independence, and they start fighting against Mexico. And that's where the famous battles of the Alamo and San Jacinto happen. And so eventually Texas gets its independence. We do not take Texas and annex it into the United States because it would have come in as a slave state, and that would have upset the balance. So it actually takes about 10 years for Texas to become part of the United States, and for that time Texas is independent. That's why Texas is always known as the Lone Star State. But it is going to show that it does show the conflict over slave states and free states. So we're talking about, this kind of goes along with the whole Texas thing. We're talking about the conflict between states' rights and federal power. What happens is that there's a tariff passed. Remember, tariff is a tax on imported goods. The North loves the idea of a tariff because they have manufacturers. The South doesn't really like the idea of a tariff because they get most of their stuff from England. And so that means they're going to have to pay more for it. South Carolina in particular gets a little crazy about it because South Carolina hates the idea of a tariff. They think that the federal government shouldn't have that power to put a tariff on them because they believe in states' rights. And so South Carolina says that they are going to nullify it. That means make it void. They're going to void that tariff and not enforce it. So what President Jackson then does is President Jackson says that he is going to force South Carolina to accept this tariff and force South Carolina to do it. And if South Carolina doesn't do it, then he's going to send in the military. Eventually what happens is there's a compromise. It looks for a while like South Carolina is going to go to war, but eventually there's a compromise reached, and the national government ends up reducing the tariff, and South Carolina ends up going along with it. But it shows that whole conflict that if the federal government passes something that the states don't like, that in particular South Carolina and some of the other southern states don't like, then they're going to threaten to nullify it, make it void, or they're going to threaten to leave. And they got that idea from back in the day when we were talking about the Alien and Sedition Acts, whenever Jefferson and Madison wrote the Virginia and Kentucky Resolves, which said they were going to nullify the Alien and Sedition Acts. So that's the whole idea behind nullification. So as we move westward, there is a big impact on Native Americans. Native Americans are displaced as we move westward. We start kicking them out of their land and moving them further and further west. The best example and the saddest example happens with the Cherokees, and that happens through the Trail of Tears. The Cherokees were in Georgia, in the northwestern part of Georgia, and they basically were getting kicked out of their land. They sued the state government over it. That's Worcester versus Georgia. They sued the state government over it, and John Marshall in his decision said that Georgia could not kick them out of their land. Well, Andrew Jackson came in and said, well, we're not going to listen to what the Supreme Court said. He said this basic quote, John Marshall has made his decision, now let's see him enforce it, because John Marshall and the Supreme Court really don't have any authority to enforce decisions. And so the Cherokees get kicked out of their land, even though the Supreme Court said they couldn't. They get kicked out of their land, they get moved to Oklahoma, and a lot of Native Americans die on the way to Oklahoma. the African Americans, the impact on African Americans as we start moving westward is if it's a southern state where they're gonna grow stuff like agriculture, they're gonna grow cotton, stuff like that. As they move westward, then slavery is gonna expand west too, and so that's the impact on African Americans, and that's gonna be the big debate as we move forward. Hopefully what you've been able to see is that the stage is set for the Civil War. There's that argument over states' rights versus national power that goes all the way back to Jefferson and Hamilton, and then we have it even further escalate with the nullification crisis. So the stage is set for the Civil War. The tension is set there. The reason the Civil War is going to happen is over the conflict between new states, whether these new states are going to be slave states or free states, and that's going to lead to the Civil War. Thank you very much for watching. Please go to Canvas to take the quiz and also turn in the notes guide. Make sure you have your name on your notes guide as well as a question that you have. Thank you very much.